It was a moonless night when Anna parked her car near the overgrown path leading to the tunnel. The air was heavy, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying wood, as if the forest itself was trying to warn her to stay away. The entrance to the Tunnel of Love stood like the gaping mouth of a forgotten beast, its once ornate archway now covered in moss and creeping vines. What little light her flashlight provided flickered against the walls, revealing faded murals of smiling couples holding hands, images distorted by time and nature into twisted, grotesque caricatures. Her heart pounded in her chest, not from the exertion of walking, but from the inexplicable feeling that she was being watched. The boat rested at the edge of the water, its surface eerily still despite the occasional ripple that seemed to come from nowhere. The wooden planks creaked under her weight as she stepped into the boat, their groans echoing unnaturally in the enclosed space. She hesitated, her breath forming clouds in the unexpectedly cold air. Something wasn't right. The water beneath the boat felt alive, as though it pulsed with a heartbeat that wasn't hers. But her curiosity pushed her forward. Slowly, she began to row into the tunnel, the gentle splash of the oars breaking the oppressive silence. As she moved deeper, the walls of the tunnel seemed to close in around her. The air grew colder, and the faint smell of rotting flowers wafted past her nose, triggering a shiver that traveled down her spine. Her flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, she thought she saw a shadow dart across the wall ahead, too quick, too vague to be certain. "It's just your imagination," she muttered to herself, her voice sounding small and hollow in the vast emptiness. But the silence didn't return as it should have. Instead, it was replaced by a faint dripping sound, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from deeper within the tunnel. The farther she rode, the darker the water beneath her became, turning from murky green to an almost oily black. Her oar struck something solid under the surface, causing her to stop abruptly. She peered into the depths, the beam of her flashlight barely penetrating the inky liquid. There was nothing there, or so it seemed, until the faintest ripple began to expand outward, too slow and deliberate to be natural. The ripple grew larger and larger, but there was no source, no movement beneath. Her pulse quickened as she scanned the tunnel around her, and then it happened, a whisper. Soft, indistinct, but unmistakable. It wasn't the echo of her own breath, it was a voice, low and wet, curling through the air like smoke. "Leave," it said, barely louder than the sound of the oars dipping into the water. Anna froze, her hands clutching the oar so tightly her knuckles turned white. The whisper came again, this time closer, more insistent. She whipped her flashlight toward the source of the sound, but the beam only revealed the jagged stone walls and the decaying remains of old decorations. Streamers and ribbons that once celebrated romance now hung like forgotten cobwebs. And then she saw it. A pale, skeletal hand broke the surface of the water just ahead of her boat. It wasn't moving, but it was unmistakably human, the fingers outstretched as if reaching for help, or something else. Before she could react, the hand dissolved back into the water without a ripple, leaving only the black, mirror-like surface. Panic began to creep in, clawing at her throat. She turned the boat, her instincts screaming at her to leave, but the oars suddenly felt heavier, as though something unseen was holding the boat in place. The dripping sound grew louder, turning into a steady, ominous rhythm that echoed around her. The walls of the tunnel began to look less like stone and more like flesh, pulsating with a life of their own. Anna could feel it now. Something was watching her, something ancient and patient, waiting just out of sight. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her flashlight flickering wildly as though it too wanted to abandon her. Then, from the darkness ahead, she saw two faint pinpricks of light, glowing red and unwavering, staring at her like the eyes of a predator. Anna's mind raced, torn between the primal urge to flee and the gnawing curiosity that had brought her here. She tried to row again, but the water seemed thicker now, more resistant, like a viscous sludge pulling her back toward the tunnel's depths. And then, as if the tunnel itself had a voice, the whisper came again, louder this time, and unmistakably clear. "You shouldn't have come." As Anna pushed deeper into the tunnel, the air grew heavier, as if the weight of the place's forgotten history pressed down on her. The rhythmic dripping from the unseen cracks in the ceiling seemed to morph into something more deliberate, almost like a faint melody, a haunting lullaby sung by the tunnel itself. Her flashlight illuminated a glimmering object wedged between two jagged stones on the tunnel wall. She leaned closer, her heart hammering as the boat wobbled precariously beneath her. With trembling hands, she retrieved it, a small, rusted locket. The locket's intricate design struck her as eerily familiar, though she couldn't place why. Opening it, Anna found a faded photograph of a woman she instantly recognized. Her Basevo. The young face smiled back at her from across the ages, frozen in time. But something was wrong. Around the edges of the photograph were faint, dark smudges that looked disturbingly like fingerprints pressed into the metal. Holding the locket, a cold wave washed over her, as if the air itself had been sucked out of the tunnel, leaving only the whispers she had tried to dismiss earlier. They grew louder now, less like random noises and more like voices. Her Basevo's name, whispered over and over, Luciana, Luciana, Luciana. Anna's vision blurred for a moment, and her grip tightened on the edge of the boat. The whispers seemed to resonate inside her skull, stirring something she had long buried. Flashes of memory flickered in her mind. Childhood afternoons at her grandmother's house, stories of love, loss, and a cursed tunnel no one dared enter. She remembered a black and white photograph kept in a drawer of her Basevo holding a bouquet of flowers in a small rowboat. Her grandmother had said Luciana disappeared on her honeymoon, and the photo was taken just before she entered the tunnel with her husband. No one ever saw them again. The locket began to feel unnaturally warm in her palm. She dropped it instinctively, watching as it tumbled into the water with a dull plunk. Before she could process what had happened, the tunnel began to shift. The walls, once static and crumbling, now seemed alive, pulsing faintly as if breathing. Anna's flashlight flickered again, casting erratic shadows that moved against the rhythm of her own shaking hand. One shadow, darker and taller than the rest, stretched across the water, standing unnaturally still despite the dancing light. It was shaped like a woman, head tilted slightly as if watching her. But there was no one else in the boat. Panic gripped her, and she tried to shake the memory loose. She looked down at the water, now so black it seemed like an endless void, and saw her reflection staring back at her. But it wasn't her reflection. The face looking up at her was Luciana's, pale and hollow-eyed, mouthing words Anna couldn't hear. She screamed, jerking back, and the boat rocked violently, threatening to overturn. When she dared to look again, the reflection was gone, replaced by the stillness of the water. Anna's hands trembled as she grabbed the oars, desperate to leave, but the whispers grew louder, echoing the name Luciana. They no longer sounded distant, but seemed to come from just behind her, so close she could feel the breath of them against her neck. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice cracking with fear. The response was a single word, soft and chilling. "Remember." As if in answer, a small box floated to the surface of the water, bumping gently against the side of the boat. Anna hesitated before pulling it aboard. The box was wrapped in decayed ribbons, its wood swollen and warped from years in the water. Inside was an old bouquet of wilted flowers, bound together by a frayed lace ribbon. They reeked of mildew, the sickly sweet scent mingling with something far fouler. Beneath the flowers was a piece of paper, its edges brittle and stained. The words scrawled on it were smeared but legible, "To my beloved Luciana. If you find this, forgive me." Her heart sank. The note was signed with the name of Luciana's husband, Raphael. The memories of the stories her grandmother told came rushing back with agonizing clarity. Raphael had been accused of her Basevo's disappearance, but he was never found. Rumors said he had gone mad after their honeymoon, babbling about something in the tunnel. Now, holding the note, Anna felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Whatever happened to Luciana and Raphael wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. And something or someone in the tunnel had been waiting for her ever since. As she looked back at the water, ripples began to form again, spiraling outward from beneath the boat. The whispers fell silent, replaced by a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate through her bones. The shadow on the wall moved again, this time stepping closer, and Anna knew one thing with terrifying certainty. The past she had forgotten hadn't forgotten her. The boat drifted further into the tunnel, and Anna felt the walls pressing closer, as though the tunnel itself was alive, tightening its grip around her. Her breaths became shallow, each one feeling heavier than the last. The air now carried a suffocating scent of decay, and her flashlight barely illuminated the path ahead. Suddenly, the boat lurched to a halt, jerking her forward. She looked down at the oar, trying to push against the invisible force holding her back, but the water resisted her movements, thick and heavy as if turned to tar. Ahead, the tunnel split into two paths. On one side, a faint, golden light shimmered in the distance, casting ripples of warmth that made the air feel almost inviting. On the other, an ominous red glow pulsated from deep within the tunnel, its light seeping like blood through cracks in the walls. A sudden chill enveloped her as the whispers returned, louder now, clearer. They didn't come from a single source. They were all around her, overlapping, echoing in the dark. And they spoke directly to her. "Choose," the voices demanded, their tone unnervingly calm, yet filled with malice. "One path will take what you hold dearest. The other will show you the truth." Anna's heart raced. The words echoed in her mind, their meaning sinking in like icy daggers. What did they mean by dearest? Was it her life? Her sanity? She stared down the golden path, her trembling hand tightening around the flashlight. It felt safer, almost peaceful, but she couldn't shake the feeling that its warmth was a lie, a facade masking something far worse. The red path, however, seemed to breathe, exuding an almost magnetic pull. It promised answers, but at what cost? The whispers grew louder, overlapping in chaotic waves. "Choose now, or we will choose for you," they threatened, the calmness giving way to urgency. Then, the water beneath her boat began to ripple violently, as if something massive was stirring below. Shapes darted beneath the surface, elongated, humanoid silhouettes that moved too quickly to be seen clearly. One of them brushed the underside of the boat, sending a hollow thud reverberating through the wood. Anna screamed, instinctively pulling her legs closer to her chest. In the chaos, a single voice rose above the others, steady and cold. "The truth will set you free. But freedom always has a price." Tears welled in Anna's eyes as her mind raced through every possible outcome. The golden light called to her, a beacon of false hope, while the red glow pulsed like a beating heart, each throb pulling her deeper into despair. She thought of her Basevo, of the unanswered questions that haunted her family for generations. What if the truth could finally end this nightmare? But what if the price was too great? Suddenly, a shadow rose from the water ahead of her, humanoid but impossibly tall, its form shimmering like smoke. It had no face, only a void where its features should have been. In its hands, it held an object, the locket she had dropped earlier. It dangled from the shadow's fingers, spinning slowly, almost tauntingly. "You cannot go back," it hissed. "Only forward. Choose." Anna's voice trembled as she shouted into the void. "What do you want from me? Why am I here?" The shadow tilted its head, as if amused by her desperation. "To finish what was started. Your blood remembers. Your soul remembers." It stepped closer, the water beneath it rippling as if boiling. "Choose the path or lose both." The boat groaned under her as the water around her began to churn violently. She gripped the oars, paralyzed by fear. Her mind flashed with fragmented images. Luciana's face, the note signed by Raphael, the bouquet of decayed flowers. She felt an inexplicable connection to this place, as though her presence was predestined, as though her life had always been tied to the horrors of this tunnel. The voices grew deafening, merging into a cacophony of screams and pleas. The red glow pulsed brighter, illuminating the walls with grotesque shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. From the golden path, she heard faint laughter, light and melodic, as if mocking her indecision. Anna closed her eyes, her hands trembling as she clutched the oars. She knew there was no escape, no way to avoid the choice. Her breaths came in ragged gasps as she forced herself to speak. "I choose," but before she could finish, the water beneath her erupted. A pale, skeletal hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with inhuman strength. Its touch was icy and burned her skin simultaneously. She screamed, struggling to pull away, but the hand's grip tightened, pulling her toward the edge of the boat. As her flashlight slipped from her hand and disappeared into the black water, she was plunged into darkness. The whispers fell silent. The only sound was the beating of her own heart, loud and desperate, as the hand released her. When she opened her eyes, the boat had turned toward the red path, the glow now surrounding her like an aura of malevolence. The choice had been made, whether by her or by the tunnel itself, she couldn't tell. And as the boat drifted forward, Anna knew she was heading towards something she could never come back from. The red glow pulsated rhythmically, bathing the tunnel in a sinister light that seemed to breathe like a living entity. The air was thick and stifling, making Anna feel as though the walls were closing in around her. The boat moved on its own now, gliding eerily forward through the viscous water. Anna's hands gripped the sides of the boat tightly, her knuckles white as a cold sweat dripped down her back. The oppressive silence was broken by a faint sound, soft at first but growing louder, a whisper that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the tunnel. The voice was fragmented, like shards of broken glass scratching against her ears. It wasn't just one voice, it was many, layered on top of each other, speaking in a language she didn't understand. But the tone was clear, angry, mournful, and accusatory. It felt like 1,000 unseen eyes were watching her, judging her. As the boat floated deeper into the glowing red light, the whispers began to form words in her own language. "Why did you come?" the voices asked in unison, their sound a chilling blend of sorrow and malice. Anna froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Who are you?" she whispered back, her voice trembling, unsure if she even wanted an answer. The shadows on the tunnel walls began to writhe and twist, taking on grotesque forms. They stretched and contorted into faceless figures with elongated limbs, their movements unnatural and jerky. One of the shadows peeled itself from the wall, its form dripping like ink, and began to slither toward her boat. Anna backed away, her heart hammering in her chest. The figure stopped at the edge of the water, its head tilting unnaturally as if studying her. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, filling her mind with fragmented images. A woman's scream echoing through the tunnel, a pair of hands reaching out of the water, and the flash of a blade. "You shouldn't have come," the voices said again, this time clearer, each word punctuated by the sound of dripping water. Anna's flashlight, still clutched tightly in her hand, flickered weakly, casting brief beams of light onto the surface of the water. Her breath hitched as she noticed shapes beneath the surface, faces, pale and distorted, staring up at her with empty eyes. They weren't just reflections, they were real, and they were watching. She leaned closer, unable to stop herself, and gasped as one of the faces broke the surface, its hollow eyes meeting hers. The figure's lips parted, but no sound came out. Instead, a single drop of blood dripped from its mouth into the water, sending ripples outward that seemed to distort the entire tunnel. The whispers became screams, a deafening cacophony that made Anna cover her ears. "Leave," they shouted, but the boat didn't stop. It moved faster now, as if being pulled by an unseen force. The red light intensified, illuminating grotesque carvings on the tunnel walls, symbols and faces twisted into expressions of pain and terror. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of it all, but the symbols seemed alive, shifting and writhing like they were etched into flesh rather than stone. Out of the corner of her eye, Anna saw movement. A shadow darker than the others loomed at the far end of the tunnel, its form impossibly tall and thin. It stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring her fear. The whispers faded into a low, guttural hum that vibrated through the boat, making the water ripple violently. The figure raised a hand, its long, claw-like fingers pointing directly at her. Anna's chest tightened, her instincts screaming at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. "What do you want from me?" she shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. The figure tilted its head, and the whispers returned, softer this time, almost mocking. "You know what we want," they said. "It has always been you." Suddenly, the walls of the tunnel began to shift. The carvings stretched and twisted, their faces screaming silently, as if they were alive. The water beneath her turned from black to crimson, its surface churning violently. The boat rocked dangerously, threatening to capsize. Anna grabbed the edges, her knuckles white, as the figure in the distance began to move closer. It didn't walk, it glided, its feet never touching the ground. The whispers grew louder once more, merging into a single, clear voice. "She chose the truth," it said, cold and emotionless. "And the truth has chosen her." As the boat lurched forward, Anna's vision blurred. Shadows swirled around her, reaching out with clawed hands, their touch icy and burning at the same time. The air filled with the stench of decay, and her head spun with the overwhelming pressure of the voices invading her mind. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the tunnel, absorbed into the whispers. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the chaos stopped. The boat stilled, the water calm once more. Anna gasped for air, her hands trembling uncontrollably. The red glow remained, but the tunnel was silent now, eerily so. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered, like a shadow that refused to fade. Anna's eyes darted around the tunnel, searching for any sign of what had just happened. The carvings on the walls were still now, but their eyes seemed to follow her, watching, waiting. She knew, deep in her soul, that the whispers were far from over. They were only just beginning, and whatever lay ahead in the red glow would make her wish she had never come. The red glow cast twisted shadows on the tunnel walls, making the space feel alive, pulsating with an unseen energy. As Anna clutched the edges of the boat, her chest heaving with shallow breaths, she felt the suffocating presence of the tunnel closing in on her. The whispers had subsided into a heavy, oppressive silence, but the air was thick with anticipation, as if something unspeakable was waiting just ahead. Each stroke of the oar felt labored, as though the water itself resisted her movements, dragging her deeper into the tunnel's suffocating embrace. Her flashlight flickered again, the beam weak and erratic, illuminating fleeting glimpses of the tunnel walls. What she saw made her heart pound harder. Faces, human faces, were etched into the stone, their expressions frozen in agony. Their mouths hung open in silent screams, and their eyes seemed to follow her every movement, reflecting her own terror back at her. She couldn't tell if they were carvings or something far worse. The light faltered, and in the split second before it came back on, she thought she saw one of the faces move, its mouth twitching into a twisted smile. The boat suddenly jerked to a stop, nearly throwing her forward. The water beneath her was no longer calm. It churned with unseen forces, ripples radiating outward as if something massive was circling her. Her breathing quickened, her fingers gripping the oar so tightly they began to cramp. She shone the flashlight into the water, and for a moment, she saw her reflection staring back at her. But it wasn't her face. It was hollow, gaunt, with eyes sunken deep into their sockets and a twisted grin that stretched too wide. The reflection mouthed a word she couldn't hear, but instinctively understood: stay. Her instincts screamed at her to look away, but she couldn't. The reflection's grin widened, and the water beneath it began to bubble, as though something was rising to the surface. A hand shot out, pale and skeletal, gripping the side of the boat with inhuman strength. Anna screamed, scrambling backward, but the hand didn't pull. It simply rested there, its bony fingers digging into the wood. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it sank back into the depths, leaving behind a faint, crimson stain on the edge of the boat. Her flashlight flickered again, casting erratic beams of light onto the walls. The faces etched into the stone now seemed to shift and move, their frozen expressions morphing into something more animated, more alive. One face turned toward her fully, its eyes locking onto hers. Its lips began to move, forming words she couldn't hear but could feel, like a cold wind slicing through her mind. "Do you feel it?" a voice whispered, not from the wall but from inside her own head. Suddenly, the silence shattered. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, overlapping until they became an unbearable roar. They spoke directly to her fears, dredging up every insecurity, every doubt she had buried deep within. "You've always been afraid," they taunted. "Afraid of failing, afraid of being forgotten, afraid of the truth. Why fight it now?" Anna covered her ears, desperate to block them out, but it was futile. The whispers weren't coming from outside. They were inside her, twisting her thoughts, distorting her reality. The tunnel seemed to respond to her fear, the walls vibrating with her rapid heartbeat. Shadows danced erratically, forming shapes that lunged toward her before dissipating into nothingness. The boat began to move again, but Anna wasn't rowing. It was as if the water itself had taken control, pulling her toward the red glow that now pulsed like a beating heart. The temperature dropped suddenly, and her breath came out in visible puffs of air. A low hum filled the tunnel, resonating through her bones, and she realized it wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, vast and incomprehensible, surrounding her, enveloping her. Then came the visions. They were sudden and violent, flashing before her eyes like fragments of a nightmare. She saw her besevo, Luciana, sitting in the boat, her hands clasped tightly around a bouquet of flowers. But her face was wrong. Her eyes were empty sockets, and her mouth was sewn shut with coarse, black thread. In another vision, she saw herself, but older, gaunt and lifeless, rowing endlessly through the tunnel, her hands raw and bloodied. The whispers shifted again, softening, becoming almost seductive. "It doesn't have to be this way," they said. "We can make it stop. We can give you peace. All you have to do is let go." Anna's grip on the oar faltered as the weight of the words sank in. She felt an almost overwhelming urge to drop it, to let the tunnel take her wherever it wanted. The promise of relief, of escape from the suffocating terror, was almost too tempting to resist. But something deep inside her, a flicker of defiance, pushed back. "No," she whispered, her voice shaking but resolute. "I won't." The tunnel seemed to react to her resistance. The whispers turned to screams, the shadows around her writhing violently, and the water beneath her began to churn with renewed ferocity. The red glow intensified, blinding her as it filled the entire space. For a moment, she thought the boat would capsize, that she would be pulled into the depths. But then, as suddenly as it began, the chaos stopped. The boat drifted forward into silence once more. Anna's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to catch her breath. The red glow still surrounded her, but it felt different now, darker, heavier, as though the tunnel was watching her, waiting for her next move. She knew the worst was yet to come. The temptation of fear had been only the beginning. The red glow grew stronger, enveloping the boat in a pulsating, almost organic light. Anna's breath hitched as the tunnel opened into a cavernous chamber, vast and otherworldly. The walls were slick with moisture, glistening as if coated in blood, and strange symbols pulsed faintly across their surface. The air was heavy, thick with a metallic tang that clung to her throat. In the center of the chamber floated an altar-like platform, suspended just above the water's surface. It was adorned with decayed flowers, rusted trinkets, and tattered scraps of fabric that looked disturbingly like remnants of clothing. The boat glided forward, as though guided by an unseen hand, and stopped inches from the platform. The silence in the chamber was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of dripping water. Anna hesitated, her body trembling as she stepped out of the boat onto the slick, uneven surface of the altar. The cold seeped through her shoes, numbing her feet. She looked down and saw a single object resting in the center, a mirror, its surface cracked and fogged with age. The moment she touched the mirror, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent, clawing at her mind with relentless force. But these whispers were different. They weren't just random voices. They were familiar. Her grandmother, her Basevo, her own voice, overlapping in a haunting symphony. "Why did you leave us?" one voice demanded. Another sobbed, "You knew the cost." And finally, her own voice whispered, "It's always been you." The mirror's surface began to clear, revealing an image that made Anna's blood run cold. She saw herself, but not as she was now. In the reflection, she was older, her face hollow and gaunt, her eyes filled with despair. She was rowing endlessly through the tunnel, her hands raw and bleeding. Her reflection stared back at her with an expression that was both pleading and accusing. "You can't escape," it said, its voice overlapping with the whispers around her. "You were always meant to finish this." Anna staggered back, nearly slipping on the wet stone. The chamber seemed to respond to her fear, the walls pulsating faster, the red glow intensifying. She turned to flee, but the boat was gone, swallowed by the water. The chamber's exit was no longer visible, the walls had closed in, trapping her. The whispers grew louder, crescendoing into a deafening roar that made her drop to her knees, clutching her head. "What do you want from me?" she screamed, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. The water in the chamber began to churn violently, and from its depths, a figure emerged. It was the same shadowy entity she had seen before, but now it was fully formed, towering over her with an aura of pure malice. Its body was skeletal yet fluid, shifting between solid and smoke-like forms. Its face was a void, a black emptiness that seemed to draw in all the light around it. But within that void, two crimson eyes glowed, unblinking and filled with an ancient rage. "You," the entity hissed, its voice echoing in her mind. "You carry the blood. You carry the debt." Anna stumbled backward, her heart pounding. "What debt? I don't understand," she cried. The entity stepped closer, its form looming over her. It raised a clawed hand, pointing toward the mirror. The reflection within had changed. Now it showed her Basevo, Luciana, standing on the same altar, clutching a bouquet of flowers. Behind her stood the shadowy figure, its claws resting lightly on her shoulders. The reflection shifted again, showing Luciana's terrified face as the figure dragged her into the water. Anna realized with dawning horror that her Basevo hadn't simply disappeared. She had been offered as a sacrifice. "The bloodline carries the weight of the pact," the entity said, its voice a guttural snarl. "One must remain. One must pay." Anna's mind reeled as the pieces fell into place. Her Basevo had been the first, but the pact had never been fulfilled. The tunnel had claimed her as its own, trapping her in its cursed depths. And now it wanted Anna. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I won't do it. I won't stay here." The entity's eyes burned brighter, and the chamber trembled violently. "You have no choice," it growled. "The pact demands balance." The whispers turned into screams, the faces on the walls contorting in agony as the water beneath the altar began to rise. Anna clutched the mirror desperately, searching for some way to fight back. The glass reflected her terrified face, but then something shifted. The cracks in the mirror formed a shape, a symbol she recognized from the carvings on the tunnel walls. She didn't know how she knew, but she was certain. The mirror was the key. Summoning every ounce of courage, Anna lifted the mirror and pointed it toward the entity. The red glow dimmed, and the chamber fell silent. The entity recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. The whispers turned into a low, guttural growl, and the faces on the walls screamed in unison. "You cannot break the cycle," the entity roared, its voice shaking the chamber. Anna's hands trembled, but she held the mirror steady. "I don't care about your cycle," she shouted. "I won't let you take me." With a final surge of defiance, she hurled the mirror into the water. The chamber erupted into chaos. The water churned violently, rising in waves that slammed against the altar. The walls cracked and splintered, the red glow fading into darkness. The entity let out a deafening scream, its form dissolving into smoke as the chamber began to collapse around her. Anna fell to her knees, gasping for breath. The boat reappeared, bobbing gently in the water as if nothing had happened. She climbed aboard, her body trembling with exhaustion, and the boat began to move, carrying her toward the faint light of the tunnel's exit. But as she glanced back at the chamber, she saw one last image in the water's reflection. Her Basevo's face, smiling faintly before fading into the depths. Anna knew she had escaped, but the truth she had uncovered would haunt her forever. The tunnel might have let her go, but it wasn't finished. The pact would remain, waiting for the next soul brave, or foolish, enough to enter. The boat surged forward, propelled by a force Anna could no longer see or resist. The tunnel narrowed as she approached what felt like the heart of the curse, the red glow intensifying until it filled every corner of the space. The whispers returned, louder and more chaotic, speaking in fragmented sentences that made her skin crawl. They weren't just voices, they were memories, screams, and prayers, all melding into a relentless, mind-shattering cacophony. The boat came to an abrupt stop in a circular chamber where the water churned as though alive. In the center of the room stood an enormous figure, far more terrifying than the shadowy apparition she had encountered earlier. Its form was massive and grotesque, a shifting amalgamation of bone, shadow, and flesh. It had no defined face, only an endless void where its features should have been, and countless crimson eyes scattered across its body, blinking in unison. Its very presence seemed to drain the air from the chamber, leaving Anna gasping for breath. "You dare defy the cycle," the creature's voice boomed, not from a mouth but from every surface around her. The words reverberated in her chest, heavy and suffocating. The debt must be paid. One must remain. Anna's mind raced as she gripped the edges of the boat. "I won't stay here," she shouted, though her voice trembled under the weight of the entity's presence. "You've taken enough. My Basevo, my family. It ends now." The creature's many eyes narrowed, and its towering form leaned closer, tendrils of shadow snaking out from its body and toward the boat. "You think you can break what has been bound by blood," it hissed. "You are the chosen. You were always meant to be mine." The tendrils wrapped around the edges of the boat, pulling it toward the center of the chamber. Anna struggled to break free, but the more she fought, the tighter the tendrils became, their icy touch searing her skin. Her flashlight flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows that made the chamber feel even more alive. The water beneath her churned violently, and she caught glimpses of faces, her Basevo, Raphael, and countless others, twisting and screaming just below the surface. The mirror's fragments floated in the water, their jagged edges reflecting distorted images of the creature. Anna's gaze locked onto them, and an idea began to form. Her grandmother's stories echoed in her mind. The tunnel takes, but it can also be made to give back. Gathering her courage, she lunged for one of the fragments, her fingers brushing against its razor-sharp edge. Pain shot through her hand as it sliced her palm, but she held on. With the shard in hand, she turned to face the creature. Its eyes burned brighter, and the air grew heavier, but Anna refused to falter. "You've taken enough," she said through gritted teeth, her voice trembling but resolute. "It ends with me." The creature let out an earth-shaking roar, and the tendrils tightened, pulling her closer. The water rose, forming a vortex around the chamber that threatened to swallow her whole. But Anna clutched the shard tightly, raising it above her head. The fragment glowed faintly, its surface reflecting not just the creature, but the faces of the souls it had taken. Summoning every ounce of strength, Anna drove the shard into the tendril that bound her boat. The creature let out a deafening scream as the tendril recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. The water erupted, and the chamber shook violently, cracks spreading across the walls as if the tunnel itself were breaking apart. "You cannot destroy me," the creature bellowed, its form shifting erratically. "I am eternal. I am bound to you." But Anna didn't stop. She reached for another shard, plunging it into the swirling water at the base of the creature's form. The screams intensified, and the crimson glow began to fade, replaced by an inky darkness that seemed to consume the chamber. The tendrils flailed wildly, thrashing against the walls, but Anna held her ground. The water began to recede, revealing the floor of the chamber, a grotesque mosaic of bones and decayed flowers, remnants of the lives the tunnel had claimed. In the center of the floor lay a single, unbroken mirror, its surface shimmering with an otherworldly light. Anna hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She knew this was it, the final choice. The mirror pulsed faintly, as though alive, beckoning her to look into it. The creature's voice grew weaker, but more desperate. "If you destroy me, you destroy them all," it said, its tone shifting to something almost pleading. "Your family, the souls you love. They will never find peace." Anna's hand trembled as she reached for the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't the Anna she knew. It was stronger, more resolute, and for the first time unafraid. "I won't let you win," she whispered. With a final act of defiance, Anna smashed the mirror against the ground. The chamber erupted in a blinding light, and the creature let out a final, agonized scream as its form disintegrated into smoke. The walls of the tunnel began to collapse, the water rushing out in a violent torrent that carried Anna back toward the entrance. She clung to the remnants of the boat, her body battered and bruised, but alive. As the light faded and the tunnel returned to darkness, Anna found herself lying on the shore, the ruins of the tunnel behind her. The air was still, and for the first time, the whispers were gone. But as she looked down at her hands, she noticed a faint, glowing mark etched into her palm, the same symbol that had been on the mirror. A reminder that the curse might be broken, but its shadow would never truly leave her. Anna sat on the muddy shore, drenched and trembling, her heart still racing from the chaos she had narrowly escaped. The tunnel's entrance loomed behind her, now silent and lifeless. The red glow that had illuminated its depths was gone, replaced by an unsettling void. Yet, the air around her was far from calm. It carried a stillness that felt wrong, a heavy weight pressing on her chest as if the tunnel's presence lingered even in its apparent defeat. She glanced down at her hands, where the faint glowing mark remained etched into her skin, a jagged, unfamiliar symbol that pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. It was cold to the touch, and as she traced its edges, a wave of nausea washed over her. The mark was alive, a parting gift from the entity she thought she had destroyed. Her victory felt hollow, like a fleeting moment of reprieve before something worse. The world around her was eerily quiet, save for the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. But even the wind carried something unnatural, a faint whisper, distant but unmistakable. It was the same fragmented murmuring she had heard in the tunnel, now faintly echoing in her mind. She pressed her hands to her ears, desperate to block it out, but the whispers were inside her now, a lingering reminder of the pact she had disrupted. The villagers had always warned people about the tunnel. They spoke of lovers disappearing, of strange lights seen in the water, and of voices calling to those who dared approach. But Anna had never believed them, not until now. The tunnel wasn't just a place, it was a force, ancient and insatiable, and though she had escaped its grasp, she could feel its hunger still reaching for her, its threads of influence woven into her very being. As she stood, her legs weak and unsteady, Anna's thoughts drifted to her Basevo. The fragments of memory and the mirror's visions had shown her enough to piece together the truth. Luciana hadn't simply vanished. She had been offered, her life stolen to feed the tunnel's endless appetite, and Anna's connection to her bloodline had marked her as the next sacrifice. The realization sent a shiver down her spine. Had she truly ended the curse? Or had she only delayed the inevitable? She turned to face the tunnel one last time, its gaping entrance a black void against the faint light of dawn. For a brief moment, she thought she saw movement, just a flicker, deep within the shadows. Her breath caught as a figure appeared, faint and ghostly, at the water's edge. It was Luciana. Her Basevo stood there, her face serene but her eyes hollow, as if she were caught between two worlds. Luciana raised a hand, pointing not at Anna, but at the tunnel itself, and then she began to fade, dissolving like mist into the morning air. Anna's pulse quickened. Was it a warning? A goodbye? She took a step toward the tunnel, but stopped herself. The mark on her palm burned faintly, a clear sign that she was no longer welcome or safe anywhere near its cursed waters. She knew better than to go back, but the image of Luciana's face haunted her, as did the countless other souls she had seen trapped within the tunnel's depths. Were they free now, or had their torment merely shifted to another place, another form? The whispers returned, louder now, rising in unison as if beckoning her back. She shook her head violently, her hands trembling. "No," she said aloud, her voice breaking. "It's over. You can't have me." But the whispers only laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent chills through her entire body. "It's never over," they hissed, their voices layered with malice and sorrow. "The tunnel waits. It always waits." Anna turned and fled, her breath coming in sharp gasps as she stumbled through the forest. The rising sun cast long shadows around her, but even in the light of day, she felt the tunnel's presence, its pull lingering in the back of her mind. Every step felt heavier, as if unseen hands were tugging at her, trying to drag her back into the darkness. By the time she reached her car, her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely fit the key into the ignition. She drove without looking back, the forest and its terrible secret shrinking in her rearview mirror. But even as the tunnel disappeared from sight, its whispers remained, faint but persistent, like a shadow she could never escape. Months passed, but Anna's life never returned to normal. She avoided mirrors, unable to bear the thought of what might look back at her. The mark on her palm never faded, its faint glow a constant reminder of the entity she had faced, and the debt that might still linger. She tried to convince herself that it was over, that she had broken the cycle. But deep down, she knew the truth. Late at night, when the world was quiet, she could still hear the whispers. They came from the corners of her room, from the stillness of her reflection, from the depths of her own mind. Sometimes, she dreamed of the tunnel, its red glow seeping into her subconscious. In those dreams, she was always rowing, endlessly drifting toward an unseen end, her hands raw and bleeding as the whispers mocked her. One morning, a news report caught her attention. A group of hikers had gone missing near the forest. Their abandoned boat was found near the tunnel's entrance, eerily intact. Authorities dismissed it as a tragic accident, but Anna knew better. The tunnel was awake again, its hunger insatiable, and it was only a matter of time before it claimed another victim. She stared at the screen, her hand unconsciously tracing the mark on her palm. The whispers grew louder, almost gleeful, and she realized with cold certainty that her connection to the tunnel would never be severed. It had let her go, but not out of mercy. It was waiting, watching, for the moment she would return. And one day she knew she would. The tunnel never truly let anyone go. It always waited, patient and hungry, for its chosen ones to come back.